Welcome back to Cove Street Boatworks, a channel dedicated to passionate amateurs and hobbyists interested in wooden boat building and restoration. I'm your host, Max Mattoon. Right on cue. Lucas, really? Welcome back to Cove Street Boatworks, a show dedicated to hobbyists and passionate amateurs interested in wooden boat building and restoration. I'm your host, Max Mattoon. Welcome to Cove Street Boatworks, a show dedicated to hobbyists and passionate amateurs interested in wooden boat building and restoration. I'm your host, Max Mattoon. Today we're going to look at a Adirondack guide boat that's an interpretation of an Adirondack guide boat. I bought this boat, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. I found it up in Sutton Lake, New Hampshire. It originally was from the North Shore of Boston. I'm guessing it was built in the 1940s or so, based on the construction techniques and based on the fasteners that they used. But it was somebody's interpretation of a guide boat. But what they did differently is they used lap strake planking on this. There was only one guide boat builder historically attributed to doing lap strake planking, and that gentleman's name was John Bice. He was from Speculator, New York in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He did a lot of livery boats, so it was a natural transition for him to build guide boats that were built sort of like the livery boats were. I thought for the briefest moment that this may have been one of his boats, because you don't see Adirondack guide boats built in lap strakes very often. Matter of fact, it's extremely rare. And this one was really well shaped. I think I saw it on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. So I had photos, and just looking at the shape that's here, this is really well defined. It's really well drawn out. But when you started looking at the inside and how the construction was done, you can see that somebody attempted to modernize the construction methods. They did use sawn frames from natural crooks, so roots or branches that had a natural shape to them. They would saw them out of those shapes, and they put a lot of effort into making these multitude of sawn frames. And like I said, the overall fairness of this hull is very, very much like a traditional guide boat. So somebody pulled this off of a plans drawing, but they made some modifications as far as how these half frames crossed across the keel. Usually the heel, the part that crosses the keel in these boats, the plank keel, usually extends from one side to the other all the way across the keel, and they overlap one another. And this gives you a very rigid form that is over that wide plank keel, so the keel itself doesn't deform or warp. He instead chose to, or she, whoever it was, chose to miter the joint and glue and clench nail it. And of course it didn't last very long, and it shifted and opened up, and you'll see that in some of the original pictures that I took. And because of that, there probably was some curvature in the keel starting to happen, and they had to nail cleats across it in various spots to keep that keel flat. So other than that, this boat has been used and well loved. There's quite a bit of wear and tear on it. There was I think there was maybe one broken frame in the very forward part of the boat up high. It was cracked. There's a lot of planking wear, tear, and damage, but it's mostly due to use or misuse, when it's out in a mooring during a storm and that kind of thing. But this is structurally held up really, really well. The outwales are pretty tired at this point. They're pretty much, worn away at the ends, and they're going to need to be addressed. There's no inwale on these per se. It's just an oak outwale that's screwed to that shear plank. Multiple places along the inside, and we'll take a closer look at that when we look inside the boat. But this is what we're going to take a look at. We're going to look at the philosophy behind the restoration, the approach we're going to take, the intended use that we're going to plan for, and we'll talk about how we approach this kind of restoration. One of the first things we have to determine when we're going to do a restoration, before we start doing any work whatsoever, before we take anything apart, is determine what our objective is for the restoration. Are we going to try to return the boat to what we perceive as new condition? This is a horrible idea. And if you go to any of the antique boat museums, if you go out to Blue Mountain Lake, for example, you will see many, many donated boats in there that the owners, had the best intentions, but they look like they were dipped in plastic. And that was never the way these boats were constructed and finished out. Never. It was not done that way. So they're very poor representations of how the boat looked original. So forget doing it as new. To restore the boat with the intention of putting it back to its original configuration and its original fit and finish is something that a lot of people will try to pursue. They'll take away the modern adaptations that have been done to the boat, the modifications over the years, try to get it back to looking like it did in the catalog details of that particular year, and do a reasonably good fit and finish on it, which in many cases was, maybe a half a dozen coats of varnish and a couple coats of paint, depending on the manufacturer and the period that the boat was produced. Don't forget, early on in the 1920s and 1930s, many of these boats were primarily for transportation. They were utilitarian at that point, and they were just beginning to cross over into being pleasure and having higher degrees of finish on them. So earlier boats, around the 1920s and into the very early 30s, had far less high quality finishes on it than boats in the 30s and 40s and 50s did. So that's another worthy objective, and that's going to set constraints on how you approach the project. And then there's whether the restoration should be aimed at just doing usage, right? You want to use the boat, you want to restore it so that it's safe to use and that it's maintainable. And in that case, you're going to have a different perspective on the scope of the repairs you're going to do. You're going to pay attention to things that are very serviceable, that are oriented toward the boat's usability, and you're going to spend less time on cosmetics and that kind of thing. And then there's preservation, restorations with preservation in mind. Every once in a while, we'll have a boat come in here that was done by a master builder, a Grant guide boat or something like that, and you really hesitate to erase what was put there by that original builder. You want to try to maintain every little aspect of it, if for no other reason that someday it can be used as a reference to see how these boats were built by the original crews and the original people. So very often we'll have boats that come in here that we do minimal restoration to make it lightly serviceable, and our purpose is to try to retain any of the original characteristics that we have. There might be a project that you want to learn from. I've done a lot of plywood prams and things like that where I wasn't all that interested in having the restored boat or even using it, but I wanted to understand the building methods that they used and how they were put together. And I just literally went through it just so I could learn about the building practices and process that was associated with the hulls. So that's the first thing you need to define. What's your objective with the restoration? All right, so now we've determined the purpose, what the goal of this restoration is going to be. So we need to take a look at the entire boat. We don't just start on the things that are obvious or the things that we think we can get done really quickly. We take a look at the entire boat, and let's just assume for the purposes of this conversation that we're going to restore this for use. Maybe we've had the chance to put this in the water, maybe just through observation, we've noticed there are problems, and we're going to list the problems that we see. We're going to list the broken planks and the worn, heavily abraded plank areas. We're going to list that this outwale is worn and no longer is really structurally sound anymore. And since this is a rowboat, we're going to have to replace these outwales. This may be leaking. There may be reasons that this is leaking. One thing that you don't want to jump to the conclusion of is that you're trying to treat the symptom rather than the cause. Leaking hulls, people automatically get the epoxy out, they get fiberglass out, they go, oh, we're going to fix this leak, we're going to fill it full of epoxy or cover it with fiberglass and epoxy. That doesn't fix the problem. That just fixes the symptom. That's not what you want to do if you're a good restorer. As a good restorer, you may go, oh, there's a broken frame. That frame has allowed the plank fastenings to work and has opened up that seam in the plank. So for me to really address that, I need to clean the seam, either refasten, with the original fasteners. Maybe I'm going to pull them out if they're screws. I'm going to fill the hole and then reinsert the screw if they're reusable. If it's clench nailed and if it's copper, if it's something that is malleable enough that it's not going to get brittle and you'll be able to tighten it, maybe I'm going to put a backing iron in there and I'm going to try to re-clench it and tighten that seam up a little bit. In the very end, maybe I want a little bit more insurance and I'll take some kind of a flexible compound and I'll put it on the outside in the seam just to make sure that even before the wood has a chance to swell back up in place and become more or less watertight, that I have blocked a little bit of that water. So again, I can use it, right? That's my intended purpose for this. So make sure that when you're listing the problems, you put them on a piece of paper and you prioritize them in terms of how they're going to impact use or safety of use or those kinds of things. That's how you're going to want to sort of drive this restoration. Don't just start doing things randomly, because that's not going to yield the overall result that you're after, which is a safe, usable hull. So in this case, I took a look at the shape of it. I put a string across it to see if there was any twist in the hull. I took measurements across it to see if it was rather symmetrical, and this hull was. There was very few broken frames in here, but these heels at the crossing of the keel for the frames, these had all opened up and they were all weak. So I said, that's the place I have to start before I take the outwales off and allow the boat to become any less of its intended shape. I'm going to fix these. So I drew the hull together just a little bit. I watched to see if that impacted the opening of these frames at the heel, and in some cases it did. So it had opened and spread like a taco a little bit. So I tried to pull it back into shape using a string across the middle to make sure that I was more or less symmetrical across the hull. I cleaned these joints out with a hacksaw. I removed the old copper fasteners and tried to clean up any remnants of the glue that was originally used in them. And then in this particular case, where there were reinforcing blocks, cleats that were put across the keel, I was able to put some screws in there. And I utilized the screws. Where there weren't cleats, then I glued with epoxy. I glued both of them with epoxy. And then I put a rivet in the joint, because the rivet was going to give me a much better fastening than the little copper clench nails did. And it was something that was removable, and it wasn't going to damage these rather short scarps that he had in here, or she. So that's what I did. I went through every frame and I opened them up and I took out the original fasteners, cleaned the glue out, and then refastened it based on what was around it, what fasteners I could use that made sense. These frames also have one screw going into the top of the frame here, into the plank keel, which is not right, because you want to go from the thinner material into the thicker material. This frame is much thicker than the keel it's going into. They probably should have gone from the outside in. I'm not sure why they did that. Probably because it was ease, it was easy to do. After I got the heels of the frames all refastened and I got the boat fairly solid, now I'm pretty confident that I can take these outwales off and I can reshape these outwales without losing shape of the hull. And I can start to look at some of the planking repair. I don't think there's any planks on here that I have to actually replace. Some of the joints, they're scarf joints, they are clench nailed and glued. Some of them are not great. I'm probably going to use, I'm not going to take them apart because I don't think there's a need to at this point. I'm probably going to use some penetrating epoxy or some regular epoxy and reset the fasteners. If there's any joints that really are coming apart, which I haven't seen yet, then I may address that differently. But I'm going to try to do a minimal amount of work on here to try to achieve my objective, which is to reuse this, to get my grandkids out on the lake with it. So that's sort of my sequence. And then there's some trim, there's some combings around the fore and aft decks that probably has to be replaced. It was pretty beat up, and you can see here that I've been stripping the hull out. The outside of the hull is pretty much completely stripped, as much as I need to. The inside of the hull I still have a ways to go on. The reason you want to strip the hull for the most part is so you can get more clarity on what kind of damage is underlying that paint, because the paint does a really good job of hiding that. So if we strip off most of the paint, then we really get a good opportunity to take a look and take a look for any kind of cracks or fractures. One of the problems with doing a lap straight guide boat is you have sawn frames on the inside that are beveled and shaped, but then the planking is lapped. And it leaves a space for a majority of where the frame would normally, or where the plank would normally hit the frame. And the only place you can fasten it is where the laps are. So the rest of it is just sort of in the air. This leaves, you know, a very good possibility of impacting the boat from the outside and splitting the plank where it's not supported. Now, classically, if you were building a lap straight boat, you jogged the frame. You'd cut little steps into it, and those steps would match the laps, and that would give you the backing you need so that you wouldn't have that problem. Fay and Bowens and boats like that were that stepped up steam bent frames onto structures like this, like keelsons on the inside of the boat, they'd cut wedges, and they'd put wedges underneath each and every space that they had so that there was contact. So that could have been done. This person chose not to do that. With a lap strake, where the planks lap, it forms a nice rigid spline longitudinally in the boat. So it gives it a lot of longitudinal stiffness and strength. And you know, the likelihood that you're going to impact these small planks in the middle where they're not supported is probably fairly small if you're careful. I'm not too concerned about it with this particular design because we will be careful with it. We won't horse around on the side of the boat. We know that that's a potential weakness. And red cedar, which this is planked with, is very, very forgiving. The quality of the cedar here is consumer grade. There was no boat building wood here, no vertical grain, clear vertical grain, or you know, 45-degree bastard grain here. This was just whatever they happened to have. So there's a lot of variability in the grain, but still, cedar is very resilient. It will take a lot of abuse before it actually breaks. So this should do well. Product placement. All right, that concludes episode 4. Thank you very much for all your support for this very young channel. I have been varying the content and the format of these shows a little bit to try to understand, you know, what people are comfortable with, you know, the duration of them and the content, the topics that we cover. So please like and subscribe to the channel and leave me some feedback. Let me know how I can make this a more interesting experience for you, what you'd like to see me cover in terms of topics. There's a huge amount of things that we could look at. I have quite a few boats in the storage barn in my son's barn that we could take a look at, a variety of things from sailboats to power boats to non-powered craft. Some of them are historically important. We could take a look at any one of those. We could talk about the builders, their approach. I have the St. Lawrence Boatworks boat that I told you about a few episodes ago, the 26-foot that's powered by a Model T engine, the original St. Lawrence conversion. We're going to go take a look at that in the middle of April, and I'm going to video the whole thing. That's going to be really interesting to go and look at. It's an unusual boat. It was definitely built for transportation foremost because there's no internal ceilings or anything. It's a big 26-foot steam bent framed launch, built very much the way St. Lawrence Boatworks built their early 1920s boats. Very little frills, and it looks very, very original. It's been in the same family for 100 years or more. So I'm looking forward to capturing that and interviewing the family that owns it and having you take a look at that. So until the next episode, thank you very much for your support, and I look forward to reading your feedback.